Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. I'm going to speak to you today about the Wold Newton hoards. My name is Andrew Woods, and this is the building I work in, the Yorkshire Museum. And this is the museum in the centre of York and the museum gardens, where if you should feel so inspired after I've spoken today, then you can go and see the hoard on display there. It's in our late Roman galleries on the ground floor. So I'm given the title of Senior Curator, but I curate the numismatic collections of the Trust. So then, the Wold Newton hoard. This is what it looks like here. It is incredible. One of those really sort of once-in-a-generation type finds that you don't often get to work with as a curator. And sort of as headline figures, it is one of the largest, certainly one of the best dated and best excavated late Roman coin hoards, particularly of the period of the Tetrarchy from Britain. It has a connection to Constantius and his son Constantine the Great, which, from my perspective in a museum, are hugely important figures in the history of York, and ones that members of the public really get excited about. So that's really why we're excited about it in the museum. But they are hugely important figures in the history of the empire and in Europe more generally, and I'll get to that shortly. But that's one of our publicity shots of the hoard. So then, what am I going to do today? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about the discovery of the hoard, when, by whom, that sort of thing. A little bit about what I've sort of termed recovery. What happens next between it being found in a hole in the ground and it finding its way to us in the museum. And then sort of focus it in a bit more detail in actually what is in it. What are the coins within the hoard? What do they mean? And how do they relate to what we know about the history of that period? We're going to talk a little bit about the accumulation. How was it put together, or what do we know about how it was put together? And then lastly, think about sort of size. Actually, how big is it? This is a big hoard, big pot full of coins, but what does that mean in terms of buying power, and kind of give the context of that? And then the last thing, which I have to address, because if I don't, you'll ask me the questions, is sort of who, when, and why was it buried? And I'm not going to name names or anything along those sorts of lines, but I'll give a sense of the answers to those questions. So then, where is Wold Newton? I didn't know until someone found a big pot of Roman coins there. But this is a map up of the Wolds, east of where we are. We're somewhere about here in York, out towards the coast. And actually Wold Newton sits pretty much right up on top of the Wolds. And it was found not in the modern village of Wold Newton, but not too far from it. And that's about as much as I'm allowed to say, I'm afraid. If we look at where, this is a map of Roman rural settlement in the area. The red lines represent reasonably substantial Roman roads, and the little purple dots spread around are where we know there was Roman rural settlement in this area. And the big red dot, this is Wold Newton. So what we would say is that in the immediate vicinity of where the hoard was found, we have very little evidence for settlement of any form, but not too far away, within a few miles, there is a reasonable evidence of occupation in the late Roman period. But it's probably because we haven't looked for it, as opposed to it's not there. And if we look at coin finds from the Portable Antiquities scheme, which are all these little dots here, this is the same Roman road along the south, you see kind of a much broader scatter than that excavated evidence, which would suggest that people right across the Wolds, at least in the late Roman period, had probably come into contact with coins, with Roman coins, and with certain areas of density around Langtoft, Thwing and Rudston, where they were used on a semi-regular basis. I say this really to point out that there is probably a reasonably significant population using Roman coins across the Wolds, but actually the character of that use, and indeed of settlement more generally in the area, is actually quite difficult to pin down. We don't know a huge amount about that at this point in time, which is one of the reasons why something like the Wold Newton hoard is so exciting. Okay, so if that's by way of introduction then, onto the meat of the matter. In September 2014, David Blakey, the man you see here in the top right, was on a club dig with the rest of the club of metal detectorists from the northeast, and he stopped, wanted to go and get a bacon sandwich. So instead of continuing on a straight line across the field, he went diagonally back towards his car, and I think was very pleased he made that decision because he got a very strong signal. Digging down, he found this vessel, which contained, by the time it was emptied, just under 2,000 Roman coins of the early 4th century. And you'll see, Dave provides a human scale here in the top left, but this image here shows that the vessel is near complete. It was damaged just around the top here, possibly where it had just been clipped by a plough or something like that, and a very small number of coins were disturbed and brought out of the top of that pot. And there's just a little bit sort of damage here, and that's probably plough zone damage. It did originally have a lid, which is formed of another fraction of ceramic over the top of it. And I don't have the video to show you today, but it was lifted whole, intact, and it took 2 men to lift it out of the ground. And it was videoed on a camera phone, which is the first hoard we have that anyone has actually the video of it coming out of the ground. It wasn't archaeologically investigated. It was, of course, found at about 5 o'clock on a Sunday, meaning everyone who could have come out and dug it was already at home or elsewhere. So they lifted it, but they resisted the urge to empty it out. They lifted it out and then wrapped it all up. And that's a very important step, and one that I highlight as often as I can, because that has huge implications for what we can learn about the hoard. And I'll get onto that shortly. Now, when they found the hoard, it wasn't the only thing that had come off this set of fields that they'd been looking at. It wasn't, a dot in the middle of nowhere. A whole variety of Roman material has come from this field and the fields immediately around it. And these are some of the sorts of things they have found. Many different coins, no other Tetrarchic coins, so nothing associated with that hoard itself, but lots of other coins which suggest that the site was in use between the 2nd century, where this denarius dates from, and at least the middle part of the 4th century, where the siliquar in the bottom right is. There's pottery, there are dress accessories, bits of brooches, those sorts of things. I haven't analysed this material yet. All I can say is that it exists, and if we were to look at it, it would give us a much better sense of what this site was. All we can say at the moment is that it is a site where things have been going on for at least 2 centuries, between the 2nd and 4th centuries, mid-2nd to mid-4th rather. But what that type of activity, whether it's occupation, whether it's seasonal, whether it's temporary, we don't know at this stage. But the long and short of it is, this is not a hoard in the middle of nowhere. Having been uncovered, the hoard was reported as treasure. The legal definition of treasure is 10 or more base metal coins, and we exceeded that number in this case by 1,848. So it's definitely treasure. And it was reported to the Fines Liaison Officer up in Durham, and legally declared treasure by the coroner not too long after that. And it was at about that stage of the process where I got a phone call, and someone said, "We've got this coin." Okay, 2,000 Tetrarchic coin. Your jaw hits the floor, and you get very excited at that point. That's that stage of the process for us. And having been wrapped up by the detectorists and transported to the British Museum, the first thing they did was take an Xray of it, which is what you see on the screen here. So hopefully you can see the thin ceramic walls of the vessel, which are these sort of lighter bits here. And then I put this up really to emphasise how jam-packed it was. You can just about make out the coin edges of some coins here, and maybe a little bit over there. But really, you've got a real mass of material stuck together there. And I put this up really to show the real value actually in this is that it allowed it to be scientifically excavated within the laboratory at the British Museum. Every single coin that came out was quite carefully logged as to where it came from, and that's really important for our interpretation of the hoard. This is an image of the different layers as they went down. So the conservators in the British Museum weren't looking for textiles or anything like that that might have suggested there were bags of money inside this pot. They didn't find anything like that. And given the relatively good organic preservation of other things, I think they would have found it if they existed. So what they did when they didn't find that was to take it off in different layers on the way down as a way of kind of getting their head around things. And so these are arbitrary distinctions. They don't actually reflect anything in the pot, but they give us a way of analysing the coins within it. And you can see the various layers as they gradually work their way further down in the images around the pot here. And there is possibly, although it's hard to say for certain, some evidence of slight parcelling to the coins, in that some of them seem to be angled in different directions, like they may have been poured or tipped or placed in at different times. But it's slightly hard to quantify that from the images that we have. But that was the impression that the conservators gave to us. And why I labour these points is that, generally speaking, we don't get coin hoards like this. Normally what we get is a pot, and then bags and bags of coins or trays of coins. And that's great and exciting and interesting, but actually having it excavated like this means that this is the best excavated tetrarchic hoard from Britain. And it gives us huge possibilities of reinterpreting the way in which this hoard was put together, deposited, and offers enormous possibilities for its interpretation, really. So this is something that gets me really excited. The other quite interesting thing is that there was quite good organic preservation in the soil, which means that on a number of the coins, we found small insects adhering to them. So if I here, so this is one coin. You can just see the edge around there. That's some lovely wold soil still stuck to it, and then just evidence for the insects, various bits of insect, sort of millipede type things. There's about 12 or 15 of these, and the joy of it is they're not just at the top, but they're kind of all the way down within the pot. I don't know anything about insects, I'm not going to claim to. So we've sent them off to have them analysed. The results haven't yet come back, but they do offer tantalising possibilities in that if we can determine what type of insects they are, it'll give us a much better sense of perhaps seasons or the use of the land in the area immediately around where the hoard is buried. Is it inside or outside? Those type of things, all of which have different entomological signals. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that it was excavated by one of the conservators. And there's some small bits of plant remains as well, but again, I don't know what they are just yet. So, having been taken out of the pot, some of them underwent conservation, and this is what they looked like when they first came out of the ground. So, all but one of the coins are what I would call a numus, what had previously been called follis, which are, in this period, a bronze coin with a silvered surface on them. And when they came out, they had this green corrosion across their surface, in some cases quite thick, in others, like this one, not so much. But what's really wonderful about it is the silver surface underneath this survives in at least a significant proportion of the coins within them. And so it's quite unusual to find them in such good condition as you do here. And we're very excited about that. 200 of the coins so far have undergone conservation. Well, I say that 199 and a half have undergone full conservation. This is our half coin, so we left half of it in its original state and half of it in a clean state, so you get a sense of the before and after, really. So that took a while, and it allowed proper identification of all of those coins down to emperor type. And at that point, you may then have, if you lived locally, you may have seen me on the news or in the newspaper desperately asking for your money about 2 years ago. We did all sorts of fundraising. So I spoke to newspapers, TV, radio, and that was because this hoard was valued at £44,220 by the Treasure Valuation Committee, which is an independent committee composed of people from museums and from the trade, and then detectorists as well. And that reward was split between finder and landowner. And that meant we had to fundraise for the hoard. So Yorkshire Post, Northern Echo, Look North, radio, TV, or anyone who would listen, really. And I'm very pleased to say that we raised all of that money. And actually, we raised that money through an enormous amount of generosity by particularly local people. Literally hundreds of donations from across the region came in. It's quite a humbling experience, actually. So if any of you donated, thank you very much. And I should also say thank you to our other sponsors, the V&A Purchase Grant Fund and the Art Fund, who helped with contributions as well. 25,000, so more than 50% was raised locally though, so thank you. And I think that's really a testament to everyone's generosity. And actually the investment in the heritage of the region as well. That's something I always like to highlight. So then, we put it on display after we acquired it, and I'll just play this through once. So that was a morning of my life doing this. So it went, after it had been for conservation, it went on to display in the Yorkshire Museum, and this is what it looks like now. You see the difference between the unconserved coins at the bottom and then the conserved coins at the top. And this will be the first time that it's been out for members of the public to see, about 1700 years. So if you came to see it on the 1st of June, there wouldn't have been many people between you and whoever buried it in the 4th century who saw it. It was put on display for June last year, and it's going to stay on display for at least the next couple of years. So if you don't see it today, you still have a chance in the future. I would encourage you to do so. So then, the coins themselves. What's actually in it? There is one, which sort of ruins everything I have to say, one tiny little coin, what I call a radiate of the 260s AD, Claudius, and then 1,857 silver copper alloy numi, which of those you see on the screen here. And they're relatively standard form. So on the obverse, on the front of those coins, they profile portrait of the emperor and imperial titles and name. And then on the reverse, most of them have this Genio Populi Romani, sort of the genius or spirit of the people of Rome on the back, standing figure of genius. And then all of them, or nearly all of them, tell us where they were minted as well. They have a mint mark on the back. If you've not seen coins like this before, they're about the size of a modern 50p piece, but much thicker, bigger coins, weighing between 8 and 10 grams. They're quite chunky things. And they were all hidden inside this, which is a Crambeck ware vessel. Very simply decorated, sort of simple line decoration on it, lugs at the top, and probably was complete when it went into the ground. It's unexceptional, with the exception that it had nearly 2,000 coins buried in it. That's the thing that makes it really interesting. It's a local ware, it's fairly typical of the period and area. And to emphasise that point, that's where it's made, Crambeck, East Yorkshire, and then all the blue dots are the sorts of places that we find it. So it's a pretty common ware across the north of Britain and along Hadrian's Wall. It's not massively thrilling, but people always ask me about it, so that's pottery 101. In terms of the coins then, and this is where I think perhaps are more interesting for this audience. This is a breakdown of the coins by emperor. And there are an awful lot of different emperors represented within the hoard. And these are the emperors who ruled the empire in the 290s and 300s, so the first decade of the 4th century AD. And it's not particularly unusual to find a number of different emperors together. In fact, it's exactly what we would expect in coin hoards of this period. And in fact, the portraiture is often quite similar between them as well. The reason that there are so many emperors represented here is that there existed a system of tetrarchy in the early 4th century and the late years of the 3rd, which it's sort of easiest to see kind of visually, really. It literally means the rule of 4. And it saw the empire divided into 4 chunks, with an emperor ruling over each. And the system was instituted by Maximian and Diocletian, the 2 emperors who are represented on the most of the Wold Newton coins. And it's a complicated subject, about which people have written a very large amount, but sort of coming from a period in the 3rd century where there was at least chaotic rule over much of the empire, it was a kind of a way of trying to control that and make it a little bit more systematic thereafter. Simplify a chaotic empire, I suppose. We see the 4 emperors here represented in statuary. This is in Venice, and this is not a coin from Wold Newton, but another one from our collection. Sort of the 4 of them together. And the way it worked was there was 2 senior emperors, one in the east and one in the west, and 2 junior emperors, one in the east and one in the west. And the senior here, you see, has his hand across the junior to his right. So you have 4 emperors, both geographically and sort of split by importance as well. And if it's complicated when I explain it like that, it's perhaps easiest if we envisage it in sort of geographical terms. So Diocletian, the senior emperor of the East, ruled this sort of purpley part of the Eastern Mediterranean here. It's probably the most powerful and certainly the most profitable part of the empire by this point, with the capital of Nicomedia. Maximian, the senior emperor in the western part of the empire, Italy, Spain, Africa, the greedy part on here, with Galerius sort of focused on the Balkans, and Constantius, and I'll come back to Constantius in particular, this yellow area, Gaul, and then Britannia, Britain. So you have this tetrarchic system with 4 different people ruling at the same time. Returning to Wold Newton, we see coins of all of these different emperors represented within the hoard. So the Augusti, the senior emperors, Maximian in the west and Diocletian in the east, and the Caesars, those junior emperors, Constantius in the west and Galerius in the east. And between these 4, they represent around 90% of all of the coins from the Wold Newton hoard. And that means that much of the currency within Wold Newton was struck in a relatively brief period between 293 and 305 AD. And the relative proportions of these different emperors are fairly typical of what we might expect in a hoard of this type, although perhaps with slightly more Constantius, which is perhaps not surprising given his sort of locality. And if you are wondering how we know, and if you've not seen coins like this before, you're generally looking for the name of the emperor, just so it's kind of in the middle somewhere. So in this coin it reads Imp, IMP, Imperator, Emperor, C, Caesar, and then Diocletianus around the top there. So Diocletian, PF, ABG, Pius Felix Augustus. So it's the kind of, when you're looking for the name of the emperor, it's in the middle there. If you're looking for them. And I'd like to briefly talk about Constantius because from a most local perspective, it is very significant. He's a hugely significant figure in the history of the Roman Empire and Britain's place within it. He's the father of Constantine the Great, and we'll get to Constantine the Great a little bit later. But he's also a very important man in his own right, one who's often overshadowed by his slightly more illustrious son. Constantius was appointed Caesar of the western part of the empire. This was, to a certain extent, a nominal title when he's first given it in the 290s. And that's because at that point in time, Britain and northern parts of Gaul were in rebellion against the empire. They were at that point ruled by, can't really see those two, these two. These are the rebel generals Carausius and Electus. Usurpers, they're often referred to. They styled themselves as emperors and struck their own coins in London in quite significant numbers, but also on the continent as well. Carausius here on the left, very distinctive portraiture. I always think he'd make a very good rugby player. and Electus here on the right. Clausius is defeated first, and then Electus in Gaul, and then Electus takes over Britain through to 296. And Constantius' first job as Caesar, it was to reconquer Britain and the western part of that empire. So in 293 he defeats Clausius on the left here, but it took him nearly 3 years after that point to ultimately bring Britain back into the empire, reconquering that province for Rome. In 296, sorry, you can't really see this anymore. In 296, Constantius sails his ships up the River Thames to London and defeats the remnants of Electus's armies. And it's commemorated on this object here, the Beaurain medallion. This is not in the Wold Newton hoard. This is a big gold thing. It's on a replica of it is on display in the British Museum. And this is struck to commemorate or celebrate, I suppose, Constantius' victories over Electus at London. So you see the emperor here on horseback, Emperor Constantius, marching into London. Britannia here depicted kneeling down before him. We know this is London, so it's LON at the bottom here. And with the ship at the bottom, so he's sailing his armies up the River Thames to London. And the legend reads, Redditor Lucas Aeterni, so restorer of the eternal light. From the kind of Wold Newton hoard perspective, it's very interesting that these coins immediately predate those we find in the hoard, but we don't find any coins of Clausius or Electus within the Wold Newton hoard at all. This is possibly because probably because they're demonetized, which is both a political and an economic function. The coins of Clausius and Electus are small, copper, about an eighth or a tenth of the size of those that were struck by Diocletian and the other tetrarchs. But it was probably as much a political thing. We're going to get rid of the currency of these usurping emperors. If we fast forward in time from 296, about a decade or so, in 305 Diocletian and Maximian retired, I suppose. And the idea would be that those junior emperors, the Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, would become Augusti, and that new Caesars, new junior emperors, would be appointed. And we see this process represented on coins of the Wold Newton. So these are two coins of the Emperor Constantius. Hopefully you can just about read Constantivis. And then what I'm going to ask you to pay particular attention to is the titles at the end here, which in this case is NOBC, Nobilissimus Caesar in contracted Latin, or the most noble Caesar. So these are coins struck before 305. Those after change Constantius' titles. He isn't NOBC anymore, he's P-AUG, P-AVG, Augustus, senior emperor title. So we can see that are represented within coins within the hoard. This political process, I suppose Constantius may have expected that his son Constantine would then become the junior emperor below him, but didn't quite go to plan. Constantius doesn't assume that title, and in fact fears for his life and flees to be with his father. Constantine flees to be with his father Constantius in Britain in 305-6. In 305, Constantius had been campaigning north of Hadrian's Wall and retired to York in the winter. And at that point, York is briefly the centre of an imperial court. Constantine is accompanying him at this point, safest alongside his father. And in an event which we could argue reshapes the course of European history, Constantius dies here in York in 306 AD. It's recorded or described by Eutropius at the top, the quote you see at the top here. He died in Britain at York in the 13th year of his reign and was enrolled amongst the gods. After the death of Constantius, Constantine was made emperor in Britain and succeeded his father as a most desirable ruler. Now that skips quite a lot of political history in 2 sentences, but it gives a sense of it. And the death of Constantius is commemorated on coins within the Wold Newton hoard, like the one you see here. So on the obverse, on the front of this coin, you have the emperor and the legend Divo, D-I-V-O, Constantio, Pio, sort of the divine and pious Constantius, titles given to an emperor after his death. And then on the reverse, you have Memoria Felix, sort of happy memories, I suppose would be a way of translating it, with the imperial eagles flanking an altar in the centre of that coin. And these were issued in the months after the death of Constantius in 306, celebrating the previous emperor. The death of his father meant that Constantine was relatively swiftly elevated to become one of those 4 emperors. And I suppose you could say he jumped the queue a little bit in doing so. On around 30 of the coins within the Wold Newton hoard, he is given, you have the image of Constantine, which you see here, and the legend NOBC, Nobilissimum Caesar. So these are coins struck after Constantius' death in 306. But what is really important and really are these coins, which are actually ever so slightly different. There are 2 of these coins in the hoard, and they have a different set of titles on them. So this one reads Imp, IMP, Constantinus, and then the crucial difference is again these last few letters, PF, ABG, Pius Felix, Augustus. These are titles as senior emperor that Constantine claimed after or in December 307, and which means this coin must be dated to that point or immediately thereafter. The fact that there are only 2 coins with these sets of titles in the hoard would suggest that the hoard is likely to be buried immediately, very soon after. How soon is very soon? Weeks, months, but certainly not years after this date. So if we're going to put a date on it, it's very, very late 307, or possibly the early part of 308 AD. And because these coins allow us that really precise dating, that sort of crossover between history and archaeology, then we can say that this hoard can be connected to a seminal point in history when Britain, and particularly York, was at the centre of events that would reshape the Roman Empire. The death of Constantius here in the city, Constantine's proclamation as emperor, and Constantine the Great, I'm sure I don't have to explain his significance, but he's the first to unite the empire under one man for nearly a century. He moves the capital of the empire from Rome to Constantinople, and through his acceptance or encouragement of Christianity, arguably changes the shape of European history thereafter. At least that's what we spin it as in our museum displays. So, having sort of talked about the sort of political history, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the kind of more general numismatic trends that emerged in the hoard. And the first of these is that the latest coins in the hoard were also struck at the most local mint, London. This is coin of London. Helpfully, it tells us where it's made, because if you look at the bottom here, you have LON. Most read PLN, but there are a small number of these relatively unusual ones. And the coins within the hoard were struck at a dispersed network of mints that stretched right across the empire. Constantius really takes over the London mint, striking quite a lot of coins there for propaganda purposes in all likelihood, but also for control. That new coinage struck to replace the old in large numbers. To give a sense of where the coins from the hoard are coming from, helpfully around 500 from London, but there's also significant numbers from Xray and Lyon, and then smaller numbers from other parts of the empire, further away you get. So the vast majority of the coins are coming from the 3 most local mints, London, Xray and Lyon, but there are also some right from the very opposite end of the empire. What I think this shows is, one, the relative connections, trade connections at this point in time are predominantly within the western part of the empire, but also that this is a region that is connected into quite an international network, stretching hundreds of miles and right across the Mediterranean. Okay, so how was it actually put together? This is where having it excavated in a lab was so useful. And that's because we've been able to analyse, I think Vincent Drost, who did the IDs in the British Museum, was able to suggest that there are different particles of currency here. If we draw a line between the bottom of the pot and the top and looked at the relative types within these, we would see that all of the coins in the bottom half can be dated to 305 or before, i.e. before the death of Constantius, before the rise of Constantine the Great. Those in the top half, the terminal dates there stretch later. That's where all of our later coins are. It's not to say that there are no older coins at the top, but all of the most recent ones are found in those top layers. What we're looking at here is at least 2 parcels of currency, possibly more, that have been taken out of circulation at slightly different times. This at least raises the possibility that this is a savings hoard gradually added to over a number of years. Perhaps further evidence in that direction is with the thinness of the vessel. I find it slightly hard to envisage that this is a vessel that was full of coins and then put in the ground, as I think it would likely have shattered. I think there is at least a reasonably strong possibility that this is a pot that was buried first and then had coins added to it thereafter. And again, the fact that we found another fragment of ceramic covering the top would suggest quite careful placement in that regard. Now, it's impossible to be absolutely certain about that. We're kind of in the realms of speculation, but I do think there's at least the chance that this is savings added to over a period of time. And the last thing that I will mention is around relative buying power. And you run into challenges when trying to figure out how much coins were worth and translating that into either modern terms or even at the time, actually what things could have bought. We're fortunate in that we have, when Diocletian created a new set of coins that are the type we see in Wold Newton, he issued a price edict to give maximum prices for a range of different things. Now, how closely this can be mapped onto what things would be worth in North Yorkshire, we have to be really careful because this is not what it was aimed to do. It's from a different part of the empire, a slightly different time. But it does give a broad sense of what some of these things may be worth. So a coin might have bought you a fish, 6 units of beer, 3 might have bought you a chicken, those types of numbers. Labourers might have been paid a coin a day, and someone with a skill, perhaps 2. And if you kind of do the maths and sort of add all of that together, you end up with kind of 700 chickens, 11,000 beers, or just under 2,000 fish. Or some mix thereof, I think, would be best. Or 6 or 3 years' wages for people of different skills. And these figures, don't take them as gospel. There's a huge amount of wiggle room there, but I put them up there really to illustrate that this is a very significant amount of money. It's not a small amount of money. This is, when it was found, it was the second largest hoard of its type ever found in Britain of this Tetrarchy period. Now it's the 3rd largest, sadly. And it's certainly the largest from northern provinces of northern part of Britain. It could be the wealth of a single person, absolutely, but that person would then be wealthy. We're not looking at a kind of normal person who wouldn't have had access to this amount of currency and certainly wouldn't have been able to accumulate that amount. Or it could be several people added to a community, a family, something along those sorts of lines. I lean towards smaller number of people rather than a larger, because otherwise I would imagine one of them would have gone and dug it back up again. But again, hard to say for certain. So then, drawing all of that together, what can we say? I'd say, first of all, the hoard has enormous significance. We can learn a lot more through proper study of it. A little bit more about the insect remains, the landscape in which it was found, the coins could benefit from a bit more analysis in terms of the layers. It's hugely interesting. It was buried at a time of enormous change within the empire, with a new emperor who would go on to be of just great significance. It's valuable. It's perhaps savings built up by a wealthy person or a small community over time. And there would appear to be selection, and a lid on the vessel certainly suggests that we might be looking at savings. Understanding why it was buried is one question, but perhaps the other is, why wasn't it dug back up again? Is it that this is someone who lost their life in a time of uncertainty? Possibly. There's certainly armies were needed to help Constantine the Great back up his claims to be Augustus, but that's very difficult to say for certain. And actually an understanding of the landscape through what was looking at the field now, the insects and those sorts of things, may give us a much better sense of that. Nonetheless, I think we can argue that it is hugely interesting and unusual hoard, and I hope that it will continue to ask and indeed answer some questions for many years to come. Thank you very much.